Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending from where you're joining from. My name is Jodine Baker, and I am the Vice President of Research, Advocacy, and External Relations at Imagine Canada. It is my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today. We're happy to have you be here for this workshop on equity in action, building and sustaining effective equity working groups. I just saw a note that there's an echo when I speak. I'm not hearing it from me, so please just let me know in the chat if that's something that's happening for everyone, and I will we'll see what we can do on our end. I'll just ask my co-presenters. I see that everyone's on mute, so just a reminder, if you're not speaking, to please mute yourself. Seems like it might be resolved, so thanks for letting me know that. We certainly want to make sure it's comfortable for everyone listening. Before we get into our conversation, we would like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical lands that we're joining in from today, even during this virtual event. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wyandot. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Personally, I am joining you today from Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude towards the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. As we are all joining in remotely, and I see some people have already jumped in to do this, please do take a short moment to reflect on the lands on which each of us are situated, the land that each of us is living on and working on that's allowing us to join in this virtual community today. And if you're comfortable, you can go ahead and share that in the chat. A couple housekeeping notes for today's workshop. We do invite you to participate using the Zoom tools at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat function for any questions that you have, or you can raise your hand. It can be hard to find in Zoom sometimes, but you can find it by clicking on the reactions button. And once you click on react, you'll see an option to raise your hand pop up for you there. Later on, we're also going to be using an interactive annotate function, which our facilitators will explain in more detail when we get to that part of the workshop. If at any point you do experience any technical difficulties during the workshop, please let us know by using the chat, and we will try and help you as best as we can. This project would not have been possible without the ongoing support of Scotiabank. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Amanda Lewis, Director, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Global Inclusion at Scotiabank. Amanda is a DEI professional with more than a decade of experience in change management, from leading cultural change in the automotive sector to driving DEI strategy for over 90,000 employees in the financial industry. Outside of work, she's an avid sports fan and foodie and enjoys spending time with her two nieces, both under the age of 6. I would now like to invite Amanda to give some opening remarks. Amanda?
Thank you so much for the introduction. First, happy Black History Month and happy early International Women's Day. Welcome, everyone. I've been looking forward to joining you today in advance of our workshop. As Jodine mentioned, I work in our global inclusion team, but like all of you, collaborate and appreciate the support from our social impact team at Scotia, along with all the work they do to amplify and support Scotia Rise and community partners like yourselves. As a Scotiabanker, I'm very proud of our support for the Equity Benchmarking Report and all the benefits that will accrue to nonprofits from across Canada for the first of its kind national survey on DEI practice. It's an exciting time for all of us. I'm halfway through the report and I find it absolutely immensely helpful in the work that I do, and I hope you do too. Our work in global inclusion is predicated on collaboration, understanding the world as it is, and pursuing a future that ought to be. And in this sense, the work we do in DEI is very much parallels the work each of you do in your organizations. Our daily work in global inclusion includes advancing equity and opportunities for employees who belong to an equity deserving group. We are a relatively small team and depend on our partners in various business lines and functions to support our strategy. It's working with our partners that makes our work so gratifying, bringing our colleagues from across Scotiabank along the very important journey of DEI. At Scotiabank, when we talk about the corporate culture we're building, inclusion is the only concept that is considered both a value and behavior. Inclusion is core to who we are and to the business we operate. We understand DEI is a strength. We know supporting the nonprofit sector makes us all stronger and more inclusive. With over 600 member organizations, Imagine Canada brings 2.7 million nonprofit workers together, focusing on every kind of service organization possible. To me, that's 2.7 million DEI ambassadors. When I had a look at all the service agencies and organizations represented by Imagine Canada, as a child of immigrant parents, I couldn't help but to think of all the newcomer clients each of you had helped to successfully integrate into our country and how impossible that journey would have been otherwise for each of them. So on behalf of Scotiabank and myself, I want to thank you for the work that each of you do. Let's continue to take this journey together, and I'll pass it back to Jodine.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your words, for being here today. And again, we are so grateful for the support of Scotiabank. Without that support, we would not have been able to do our initial research study and then create the development of these actionable guides. I would also like to thank our advisory council. You can see on the screen their names and organizations. Their time and contributions to this project are so appreciated. We really rely on working in a collaborative space, and each and every one of them contributed in meaningful ways to this project. I would now like to turn things over to two members of the Saltwater Consulting team who led the development of these guides, and they are going to be leading our workshop today. Kira Page and Emile Brions. Over to you both.
Thanks, Jodine. Yeah, we're really excited to be here today and share with you a little taste of this guide that we put a lot of heart and soul and thinking into. When Imagine Canada approached us to work on this, part of the research that had already been done prior to this showed that organizations who had an equity working group were able to point to quite a few more concrete changes that they had made in their organizations regarding equity than ones without. And that kind of supported Emil and I's experience as consultants who've worked with many, many nonprofits where, equity working groups are not a perfect model and they have a lot of challenges, and we're going to talk about some of that today, but also that having an equity working group does kind of work as this kind of a rallying point for organizations to move things forward and move into action, and has some really effective impacts. And so that really drove the need for, okay, this kind of structure really does work. So how can we support people in making it work better? Organizations who are already using this model, or organizations who are thinking about it, how to set it up well. So Emil and I have been working for 10 plus years, mostly in Quebec, but also across Canada, with nonprofits, and often, although not always, related to equity, diversity, inclusion questions and change management questions. And so that really informed this tool, which we've structured, and we're going to go through these different pieces together briefly anyway, which is one about sort of the creating of it, who's at the table, and how do you set it up for success, and what is also the goal? And then also, how do you move to action? And a lot of you had questions about how do we actually get stuff done and not just talk. And so that was probably the biggest theme in the registration form questions that people had. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And then we're also going to talk about how to stay in the work when things get hard. It's a challenging moment, politically, socially, um, for this kind of work. We wanted to address that a little bit. How do we how do we stick with it in moments that are more challenging? And then lastly, that these questions about reflection and evaluation and how are we doing? So that's kind of the sections of the tool itself and the guide itself. And that's also how we're going to move through the conversation that we're going to have today. Um, yeah. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Emil.
Thanks, Kira. Hi, everyone. So we just want to first get a sense of where are folks at in the space. So in the chat, could folks let us know if you already have an equity working group or you're still sort of thinking or considering um, setting one up or somewhere in between so we can get a sense of generally where folks are at in terms of who's here with us today.
Yeah, and I recognize a couple of faces. So also, if you're actually a consultant who supports
Oh,
organizations, my guess is that at least a few of you are more in that role. But that's maybe more about who I who I know, who we know. Yeah,
so
just getting.
we do have a mix here. Some folks who are part of sort of pretty specialized committees already, or there are several committees or working groups already carrying equity mandates. Some folks getting started. Some people are here who are just curious about the work as well. Um, that's great. Well, and just to say, we really hoped that the tool is written in such a way that it's able to meet where everyone is at and that there's something for folks, regardless of where you are at in your journey, to take something away from going through our tool together. The other piece that we want to go through with you um, as we go through the tool with you is this idea of a paradox. And these are things that Kiera and I have experientially we've experienced this in our work. We've witnessed this in other folks' work. We've also gleaned it from how people have written about the work of equity and inclusion in organizations and in group contexts. And it's work that's full of paradoxes, two things that are opposite or seemingly contrasting or diametrically opposed, but nonetheless can be true. Um, a classic example of that is one must go through pain in order to know ease, or one must know deep sadness in order to know true um, joy. And so today we invite you to hold these with us and to really practice, holding all the truths that both sides might hold in the situation that you're going through. Paradox. Kira.
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to start with is just talking about the role that an equity working group is playing in your organization and what is the point of it. And so some of the questions that we saw coming up in the registration form answers were, how do we make sure that our equity working group leads to concrete actions? What kind of roles can be within an equity working group? How does an equity working group sort of interact with management or leadership to make sure that there's accountability? And how do we make sure that there's the right voices? And, there's many answers to these questions, but I think one of the first answers is really about defining the purpose of your equity working group, not the members within it first, but what is it actually trying to accomplish? And we kind of tried to divide it into these different categories. So one of them is assessment and evaluation. So this is really just monitoring how the organization is doing. This could be, the other tool that was launched in conjunction with this one is about equity audits, or the idea of assessing how are we doing? Like, how is our staff? How are our participants? What are the actual equity issues? Um, and so, if that's really the main focus, we would think about that as an assessment and evaluation focus. And really the purpose of the group is to figure out some of the answers to some of those questions. Another possible role is around oversight and centralization. So it's really about a gathering place for all the different equity initiatives, and make sure that those initiatives are talking to each other, make sense, are well resourced, have the support they need, are kind of copacetic. Um, Another possible role is around advisory or coaching. So that's kind of more about making recommendations to people who do have kind of an ultimate decision-making power, and or other key collaborators. And that, I think that is quite an important role, in the sense that equity working groups are by nature cross-organizational. They touch many different issues. So that's a really frequent role where you actually can't really be the final decision-making authority on somebody else's or many other people's workflows. So you're kind of a partner to other parts of your organization. They can play a strategic role, so defining the vision and the long-term vision and strategy of the organization to achieve these equity inclusion goals. Um, Another word here that can be useful to think about your purpose is stewardship, right? So how do we kind of care for the work as it's going along? How do we troubleshoot, raise concerns? Say we're about to, walk off the edge of a cliff. Can we pull back for a second? And implementation. So that would be actually doing the work. Like, we're actually writing the policies. We're actually um, offering the trainings that our team needs, things like that. So you might have several roles, um, but it's been our experience that equity working groups actually rarely define what their purpose is before starting. That's one of the things that people just assume there's some alignment on. And that can really cause a lot of confusion and sort of lostness later down the line. And I'll give a really specific example. One of the really big or most frequent sources of confusion that we see is the difference between what we might call an equity working group and an employee resource group. So I know that in nonprofit, we don't always use employee resource group. Sometimes it's more of a corporate word, or we might say, people with lived experience, something like that. And an employee resource group has this purpose of um, supporting the well-being of people who have a shared lived experience in that organization. So we might have a employee resource group of our Black staff, or we might have an employee resource group, sorry, for our LGBTQ plus staff. And they have this purpose of supporting the members of that working group. They can also have a purpose of making recommendations for structural improvements. But one of the most frequent sources of tension and conflict is this that we see is this group for the well-being of the people who are in the group, or is it for the organization overall? And those two purposes can work together and also not, right? And so that's one of the biggest, the most frequent examples. But also another example, like implementation versus strategy. I think that comes up a lot in the organizations that we've worked with. Are we actually doing the work? Or are we thinking about, is the work actually shared amongst the whole organization? And we're more on the strategy part. Um, so we're going to use Annotate for a second. So on the bottom left of your screen, there should be like a little green pen kind of symbol. Do people see that? Okay. So when I move to the next slide, you're going to be able to draw on the screen. And you can choose either like a pen, the scratch. Yeah, exactly. Or a stamp function, whatever is easiest for you. And the question that we have is really, um, what role, if you have an equity working group right now, what role is it playing or roles? And you can put stamps in multiple categories. If you don't have one, what would you need ideally? Do you need more strategy? Do you need more advice? Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. Implementation. Yeah. I mean, part of what I'm getting is that many working groups are playing all of these roles, or maybe, I can't tell who has put which stamps in which boxes exactly, but um, yeah, it doesn't surprise me about the nonprofit sector that people might be me doing everything. And so this is, an obvious kind of second reflection that we aren't going to do as a group today, but is the role that your equity working group is currently playing, is it really what you need? And is it in line with the reality of your resources or your capacity or who's on the working group? Um, yeah, so I'm going to, um, I think when I go to the next side, our stamps are going to stay, so it might look a little chaotic until I wipe them. Um, but is it this one? Yeah, I want to just look at this. So the role in reality. So, one of the things that we wanted to highlight is also what does your organization need, but what is your group capable of? So, we had some comments from people saying, we're entirely volunteer, we all have multiple roles to play. We don't have really, we all have jobs outside of this, and we're struggling to do implementation. Like that makes absolute sense to me because implementation is probably one of the most resource heavy purposes that you can have, right? And that isn't shared across your organization. If there's no leadership or governance representation on your working group, it's going to be really hard to be doing strategy, right? So thinking about what is the need, and also what is the reality of your organization. So, and this brings us to one of the paradoxes that we also see often in this question about purpose of, this our purpose is to do work that supports everyone, and our purpose is to do work that supports specifically people. And as Emil explained about paradoxes, both things are true, right? Like we both have to focus on groups that experience systemic oppression and consider the unique barriers that they face, and also equity work and inclusion work affects everyone, and everyone has something to say about it, and everyone is both a part of the problem and the solution, right? So kind of balancing those purpose considerations. Um, and I'll hand it over to Emil to talk about members.
Thanks, Kira. So, yeah, this section in the tool goes over the people piece of your equity working group, right? We talk about what's the right number for your organization, right? Obviously, for a grassroots community organization where you're three staff, the equity working group is the entire staff. And if you're in a larger organization with a lot of departments and units and areas, right? There might be consideration about, having a good representation from that versus what's a good and agile number to have in an equity working group. You might also consider what's appropriate for your organization around having leaders, management, or senior leaders on the committee, or you don't want that. You just want staff members without management or supervisorial roles, or if you want to involve your board in it as well. You might also involve the wider community beyond your workplace, working with members of your organization, for example, or service users. You might also have considerations around diversity and representation. If you are, say, a group who's specifically working on, say, gender-based violence, and that's a specific mandate you have within your group, you might have to think about, okay, what's a good way to do this to make sure that we have representatives from a multitude of experiences of gender and gendered violence. And you might also be thinking about competencies and skills that are needed for your equity working group. And um, one thing that we always want to invite folks to consider is you don't have to be good at everything as one individual, right, in order to do this work. Your group does, or your group should think about, okay, do we have enough of some core skills and ways of doing and being in our group so that we can collectively, as an equity working group, as a committee, do our jobs and fulfill our roles, right? And so the competencies that we go through and name in the tool are first anti-oppression and systems of power. So people who have a good enough understanding of the issues, right? And of course, we can't be an expert on all issues of oppression, systemic oppression, and power. And some thought around how much do you need in order to at least meet that sort of baseline in order to reasonably fulfill your role in the equity working group. Your group or enough people or someone has to be at least good at this skill of holding change, right? Being able to look at the meta of what's going on in your group and thinking about sort of what is the culture, how are decisions made, how does power move through, how do people behave, react, and relate to change, how do they interact with each other in moments of challenge. The third competency that we go through in the tool is strategic thinking, which is sort of there's that technical aspect of strategic thinking as well, and you're able to sort of apply this analytical piece into a more technical, more applied aspect in your organizational life. And then the last piece, and well, this is me, but I don't want to speak for you here, but I think you feel it too, right? This fourth piece is like, I think our favorite, and we think is the most important, right? It's having good relational skills, being able to connect with people, especially with people who experience systemic marginalization and oppression, people who are able to engage in mutual support and communicate across differences and stay together in the midst of tension. So again, you don't have to be good at all these things. I don't think I'm good at all these things, right? But certainly your group has to think about how all four of these are within the group, and the group is constantly building towards developing these competencies. And then using our favorite annotation activity, we'd like to know, for those who do have equity working groups or committees already in your context, right? Where do you think your group is sort of strong and sure at? You feel like your group has the right number of people and you've done a good job of calibrating that number? Or do you feel that your group is good at delegating, distributing, sharing the roles within the committee? Do you feel that your group is has had this whole diversity and representation piece, that you have the lived experiences that you need at the table, or enough diversity of lived experiences around the table in order to do your jobs well? And then do you think your group has been good at this piece of developing these core competencies? Okay. It seems like people are great at everything. Well, I love that. Well, I don't know if you're, I actually don't know if the one organization went, I'm good at everything, but I love that for you if that is your reality. Props to you. And I'm also seeing a little bit of like maybe perceived sparseness around distribution of roles, which is interesting as well, right? Clarifying roles. What do you mean by roles? What are the roles in a committee? Um, can we go to the next one, Kira, for and in terms of where you think your committee could be stronger, we'd love to know. I'm also seeing extras in the chat shouting out capacity. Absolutely. We hear that. And we also saw that in the questions. How do we create more capacity for this work? Yeah, relationship building. Yeah, that's one of the competencies that we named in the four competencies. How do you take care of relationships, not just in the moment, but over the long term in doing this work? And seeing also lots of concentration around distribution of roles and perhaps a little bit around diversity and representation. Okay.
I'm just gonna clear this.
Hmm.
Clear all drawings. Perfect. Um, yeah, and I saw this comment in the chat about the purpose, or sorry, setting boundaries, and maybe something that I would just add to that earlier piece about what is the purpose of your working group. I think being clear about what your role is as a working group, the flip side of that is also then saying, what is the responsibility of the rest of the organization? In terms of equity. If we're doing strategy, what is people's implementation? And I think that having clarity about what is our role as a group and what is the responsibility of everyone else according to where they're sitting and what they're doing, I think that to me, that is kind of the starting point for the boundaries conversation, and so it's not just like every time an equity issue comes up, someone sends you an email and says, hope you can respond. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Emil, do you want to talk about this paradox or do you want to? I'm happy to do so too. Or yeah.
Yeah, I think sort of just a last couple of pieces around this, building your equity working group. Some of you might be thinking about this, okay, we have this ideal team, right? And in order to build this team, we have to have a very meticulous, robust recruitment and selection process that is pretty resource intensive. Um, and then also this idea that actually there is this reality that we're living in where we might not be able to have all of the voices at the table for whatever reason. I just think about, for example, in white majority or white dominant organizations where they are struggling to get Black, Indigenous, and people of color around the table, or enough of them around the table, um, partly for many reasons. One is there aren't enough people of color at the organization, so it would be a lot on that minority of folks on that organization. Perhaps there's also a feeling of burning out or racial fatigue that is preventing people from joining, right? And, a couple of things that we've learned in doing this work alongside organizations or as part of organizations is that it's still important to do the work, right? And find the opportunities to do the work. And, some of this is some of the issues or questions around building the ideal team is that whole long-term relationship building process. Perhaps maybe there's something around building trust with people of a certain identity or experience in your organization before you can actually get them to trust joining the committee with you. And also, there's this additional resource that we actually cite on the tool, and it's also in these slides, which we can send around as well. But UBC has a really, really straightforward tool around, okay, how does co-chairing and co-facilitation work, or facilitation and chairing work, and what would be a good way for our organization to navigate these questions. And it also has some stuff around what's a good way to document our work and make sure our work is well documented and well organized around logistics. So we invite you to consult that tool, please. Oh, is it still me, Kira? Oh. Oh my gosh, so sorry. So, yes, people. So again, continuing on this question of the people of your equity working group, right? We want to go through now, okay, what does it mean to work with each other and collaborate? And some folks raised a few questions along those lines in the registration form. How do we ensure equal participation? How do we address a lack of participation of particular demographic groups in our organization, right? How do we take care of people of marginalized identities and experiences as we do this work as an equity working group? And also, how do we, how do we make sure that it's a democratic space? People feel heard, seen, valued, recognized. Um, and uh, in the tool, we go through some quick points around how do you build your group? What are the elements of building a healthy collaboration in the equity working group? And we talk about fostering trust and psychological safety. What does it mean for someone's vulnerabilities, both systemically and interpersonally? What does that look like in doing equity work? Also, we also go through in the tool establishing collaboration norms, some agreements that everyone agrees to among the group. Like, for example, uh, we will meet once a month, right? And we will make time. And if we are to miss a meeting, we will send our regrets by X, Y, Z. But also, other norms like, yeah, take care of your bodies. And we encourage direct and caring feedback. Um, a sub point to that is, ensuring that when there is tension, disagreement, there's challenges, right? That you build this muscle of acknowledging what is happening rather than keeping quiet about it, or just, passing it over, right? So building that muscle in your group of being direct and also caring for sure. Using simple facilitation strategies like, opening your meetings with some simple check-ins, right? Doing check-outs um, at the end, right? Making sure you build in breaks or calling breaks when it's getting hard, especially for people with lived experience in the room, right? Cultivating deep listening within your group. And we active listening is a great skill. And what we really want to encourage folks is, this idea of deep listening, to really deeply be present with someone, to also look for what's not being said, right? And to remain curious with each other, to continue to welcome disagreement and alternative views, right? And then there's this other meta skill that we want to share with you called leaning in and leaning out. And there's this phenomenon experience, right? When, for example, you are someone with a particular privileged identity, right? And there's this idea of, okay, I need to be really careful about how much space I take up, and I need to like make myself smaller, but also, oh, I kind of need to actually use the platform or the leverage that I have and actually be bold in this moment. Um, and these two things are have to be true and can serve you depending on the context, right? And practicing the skill of, okay, knowing when it's time to lean in and be there and present and more visible and seen, and leaning out when it's actually time to make space for others. And sometimes, actually, when we lean out, it allows others to take up space and feel that they can, take those risks. Um, yeah, and that's just the last piece around lack of participation is usually a symptom of the working group, not the person. So we have to try different ways of how do we encourage participation from folks who might not be participating. And it takes some experimenting and delicate dancing sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's like, Mel and I had talked about a couple experiences we had around this question of collaboration and then lead up to this. And, one of them was a working group where, the overall context of the organization was that there was a lot of mistrust between people in different kinds of positions. So different departments just, or different roles really just had this kind of honestly long-standing sort of antagonism. And so the way that that showed up in the working group was that people would bring an idea and then we'd spend the whole meeting criticizing that idea, you know, and then that would be it. So that same thing would happen at the next meeting. Somebody would bring like a what if we did blah, 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 and then it would just be all the reasons why that's not a good idea. And then that was that. And so part of what was needed to turn that working group into an effective working group was really like this first bullet point about trust and psychological safety, that the working group didn't have the power to change the larger organizational issues, but as a group, we had to talk about what does this group need to trust each other enough to not just be continuing this kind of battle that's playing out organizationally and to move things forward, and also to have each other's backs when initially, what was obviously going to happen was as soon as they did agree on an initiative, they were going to bring it out to the rest of the organization, and the same thing would happen where they would all get criticism, right? And so to feel like really solid together. We just want to share, like, there's many, many versions of how work, like the collaboration issues are the block that you're having, but that's, one example of how kind of the collaboration issues that any group might experience, but specifically informed by the context of your organization might be kind of the sticking point that you might hit in terms of being able to actually get things done. Yeah. Which kind of leads to, this other question of, I said this at the beginning, a lot of people had mentioned this in the registration form. How do we actually go to action? How do we make sure that we're actually doing things? How do we maintain momentum? How do we work with the capacity that we have? How do we sustain our work over time and not just, go hard and then um, be exhausted? And like I'm seeing in people are talking about burnout and boundaries and stuff also in the chat earlier. Um, this is both this question of collaboration and this question of action are sort of linked to another polarity that is kind of in there, which is equity work creates safety and equity work creates pain, And so both are true. Like equity work can really build, like our hope, of course, is to build more inclusive, more welcoming places for everyone. And also sometimes in the process, actually it can harm relationships, harm people. It's kind of messy and hard work. And so how do we, that's not the only reason that people are burnt out or tired or struggling to participate, but it's certainly one, and so that's one of the realities, I guess. And I haven't seen anyone fully avoid this polarity, right? And so how do we work with it and say, like, both of these things are true, and how do we care for ourselves so we can sustain this in a meaningful way? And another polarity that we see that's kind of related to the action, and sorry, I'm using polarity paradox, related to this question of action, getting to action is, people, I think we see equity working groups get stuck with, on the one hand, we have to be really careful. Like these are really delicate and sensitive issues. And if we make the wrong decision or if we choose the wrong strategy, um, things could go really off the rails or someone could get hurt related to the last paradox we talked about. On the other hand, we have to get moving. Like we have to do things like actually delivering on our intentions and our desires is what is going to build trust and make people feel like it's worth it and actually make it worth it, right? Like it's not worth it to just talk about things in potentially also painful ways and never do anything. So both of these are kind of linked to this question of action, and it's both, again, both are true, right? You have to both be careful and you have to get moving. And so we had a few tips in the guide around balancing those two things while you're getting into the action mode. One of them is this concept of the speed of trust, right? So how do we um, go where at the speed at which at least the members of our working group are like, yeah, that makes sense. Like I'm on board, let's do it. And I'm willing to take the risk that it might not be the right thing. How do we not go so fast that we actually break things in the process? And I think, we can probably all think of examples of sometimes the equity work gets led by the most, um, kind of people who are deep in the thinking about these issues and really want to see things move quickly. And then there's often a backlash, right? So it's not like we're going to avoid backlashes at all costs, but how do we move in a way that that is, you know, at the speed of trust. I'm gonna not try to reinvent that idea. Um, Other tips for us is like go where it feels alive. Like we see a lot of working groups that are just like, what is the most strategic solution or impactful or whatever? And sometimes it's just about everyone's excited about this one idea. It might not be the biggest idea, it might not be the idea that affects the most people, but just there's a sense of excitement about it and like motivation. Like do that. It's better to start with something and have it go well and try something out than to have the perfect option. So, going where it feels alive. Another place that we see things getting stuck is there's often existing work that's happening around equity that's actually working well. And just being like, what would you need to make this a bit bigger? Like, what would you need a bit more time? Do you need a bit more support? Do you need to more training, and so supporting existing work and kind of amplifying it, um, clarifying your goals and roles. So like what we went through at the beginning. One of the th reasons that we see people getting stuck at this action point is because there isn't clarity about who does implementation or what is the strategy or what is our role, what is it you're even trying to accomplish. It's very hard if that's not clear to say, well, then these are the right actions to take. Do one thing and do it well. And don't be afraid to scale back and take on less ambitious projects, right? It is, again, like small, if the change that makes sense is um, to do a light rewrite of your hiring policy or your job postings to be more clear about your values, and that would take, 3 hours and one meeting. Like do that, even though it's not the most impactful or all these things. So scale back and find more chewable options. Um, and that leads us to this kind of staying in and reflecting on the work. I mentioned this when we started. There was this question, there was a few questions like this. Um, what do we do when we get stuck? How do we move beyond the trainings and the action plans to keep the momentum going? How do we keep it embedded in everyday action and engagement? I think there's so many questions in this one question. And I think part of the stuck can be ourselves, like we're stuck as a group, and part of the stuck can be external, like there's a resistance or there's backlash to the things we're doing. So on the internal thing, I do think we see a lot of groups get stuck at what we would say is like entry level or kind of limited solutions, and those are almost always training and I would say recruitment, like are the kind of top two, and recruitment is literally an entry level solution, right? It's just when people come in the door. And so, how can we challenge ourselves to think past those two places? And even within training, some people get stuck at we're just going to do an equity 101 workshop like once a year. Pushing past that can look like how do we do, equity train, like how to be more accessible to people with auditory and visual like disabilities in our communications and marketing. Like that will take your organization a lot farther than a generic kind of equity 101 training. So are the solutions that we're choosing, are they those two? And is there a way to move past that? Are we stuck because we're really afraid of causing harm? Is that the fear? And how can we just kind of acknowledge that fear and figure out what it's about? And sometimes it's because we've done things in the past that haven't worked, and then because we're so stressed and burned out and tired, we haven't taken the time to figure out what we should have learned from that. And so sometimes it's like, doing the same thing over and over and hoping for different results. Thing that happens with humans and organizations, right? So how can we pull back and say what has been working and not working about what we've been doing? Um, on the other hand, there can be this more question of resistance, right? Resistance to the work is going to happen, and it can happen on for many different reasons, right? And from many different kinds of stakeholders. So really understanding it, the thing that Emil said about deep listening, like what are people saying to us? I think on equity issues, people tend to say eh, be very diplomatic about their feedback. And so there is this skill about listening for what are people actually saying to us. They're um, beyond, oh, I'm not sure if that really landed. Like, what do you mean? Like, are people actually furious, about the tone of that speaker that we invited? So really understand it, be prepared for it. And there's kind of like an internal steadying that needs to happening as individuals and as the group to say, yeah, mistakes, missteps might happen. How can we be kind of calm enough as a group to say, let's really understand it? And then is it feedback that we want to take or not, And revisiting again, like what is the purpose of what we're doing here? One of the polarities that we see here is like there's no one right way, right? On the one hand, there's so many ways to make change around equity, inclusion, diversity issues. There's no perfect option or universally applicable option. Um, there are bad ways, right? Like, there are some ways that are just not a good plan. And, I think maybe some really specific examples that we do see coming up is people are so worried about the diversity and representation on their equity working group that they force people to disclose that to their colleagues that they are disabled or queer and they're not actually out. Like there are ways to do this work that causes more harm that's not helpful. There's no we have to go through to get out way. And so, and it comes back to that other polarity about we have to be careful and we have to get moving. These are all true and balancing these as we go. And related to this is also one around we need everyone if we want to be successful, and we need everyone to be on board. That resistance question comes up a lot, like, and we definitely can't wait for everyone to be on board, right? Like there's some people who are not going to be into it, and we can't wait for everyone to be wholehearted equity advocates in our organizations to move forward. And so, balancing those two things also, as you think about your actions. And taking the time to reflect, and reflection can look like appreciating the people who are doing the work, documenting the work, where were our challenges, where were our pain points, how do we own that we said we were going to do something, we didn't do it, um, what happened, why did that happen? Maybe hearing from people who don't want to be on the equity working group, but do have something helpful to say to us about where things have worked or not worked. And just, taking moments, and it can be really formal when we talk about reflection and evaluation, or it can be really just that meeting that's at the end of the year to say, like, how did this go to, how was this for us in the last year? And let's just chat about it, and having that kind of step back sort of posture. Um, yeah, and some of that is kind of some of our answers to these questions that you had put also in the registration. How do we foster accountability? How do we show that we're doing what we said we're going to be doing? How do we learn the right lessons? How do we go from performative to authentic? Like, these are very big questions, and we're not pretending to fully answer them, but I think that's some of the places that we would start, and try to share in the guide. So I'm going to stop there, and just it's 1:57, so we have 3 minutes left, but maybe we can take a couple of questions.
Kira, there
Yeah,
were actually like like as we went through, there were a couple of questions that I feel like we could pick up before we take hands.
sure.
And there was one question around, some ideas around how we build connection and relationships in the group, right? Um, I don't know if your respective context or committees or working groups would have space for this, but we encourage you to make it happen is doing like retreats or half-day retreats, every year. And that sort of answers a little bit around how do we build connection, doing the work together, learning together, reflecting on the work together, evaluating your work together, say over the year, right? It helps foster accountability. It helps you witness each other in the work. And it builds in some togetherness time, some also informal time, because at these things you're also eating, sharing meals together and sharing breaks together. So I know that's like a very concrete one example, but we really encourage your committees to implement something like that.
Yeah. The need for trust on these groups is higher than the board recruitment policy review committee, you know? So thinking about how to build that in, to build the time to build that trust in the group. Yeah. I saw there was a hand earlier from someone who is called the BC Museums Association, maybe. I don't know if that person. Yes.
Yeah, that's me. Thanks everyone. This has been a wonderful presentation, and I just really appreciate it. Thank you all. I'm kind of curious, just in circumstances where there's like a really, I think, just like kind of, I've seen equity groups where they're doing exemplary work, or I think things are going really well. Um, um, and then I think I've also seen the resources not catch up to that. And I've seen the sustainability not catch up to it. And I think your presentation today was really strong with um, you got those multiple quadrants or columns, and you might be strong in one and you're not strong in other. And I think that kind of answers the question for me. But just kind of what kind of advice would you give to people who are in those circumstances where they're doing incredible work, but they're spread, maybe they're leveraged in one point and they're not leveraged in the other points, or they're trying to sort of like move back often, and often quite far down their commitment, and then sort of realizing um, the in a world where sort of funding kind of just runs out, how do you step all that back, and what might be some ways to think about that kind of work?
Mhm. Thank you for that question. That is such a good question. And I don't know, there was a question in the registration form that was, our equity work has been doing amazing work. and but we're pulling together money from like, $10 here and $20 here and some creative accounting. And I was like, that's a really good and profound question in lots of ways that I wish, anyway, I've been thinking about it since I read it. I think the answer, there's multiple, but I think I would come back to that place of, instead of just, I think especially in, under-resourced nonprofit land, we're just like, go, 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 go. And taking the moment to be like, hey, we can't do the things we've said we've been doing. And how do we just take a moment to take that bird's eye view and say, what would we need to do what we want to do and sustain it over time? Um, and if we can't get that, what does that look like? I don't think we can't like create time and money out of thin air as much as we actually do run on that belief, I think, a lot in community work. Um, so, taking that moment and being realistic. And I think it also comes back to that boundaries piece of saying, this is what we can do, but if you want us to do that, this is what we need, you know. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but thank you for that question. I'm seeing people having to drop off, so I just wanted to say that there's the URL here. We're going to Imagine Canada is going to send the recording later this afternoon along with the slide presentation that we used today. And then I really hope that people check out and share the resource. This was like a tiny piece of it, but it was such a delight, and we really hope it's useful to people. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.